Bodgies and Widgies, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be very different to what we've actually done in the past on the channel before, and it's not actually going to be all that much fish related. Today I wanted to actually talk to you about this little thing. That is a live earthworm which is moving around on my hand, and in today's video I wanted to talk to you about some of the benefits and just how easy it is to actually go ahead and culture or grow earthworms in your backyard. We'll go through a very simple backyard setup, some of the things that you need to be aware of, and just talk about the overall simplicity and why it can be so beneficial for both your garden and also if you have pets like fish or reptiles or even birds who may actually get a lot of benefits from eating earthworms as well. So I really hope you enjoyed this video, and before we get into it, as always, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the people that are managing our land as well. But I say, without further ado, we're going to have a look at some creepy crawly earthworms. Earthworms are an extremely beneficial and easy to grow species. They offer a ton of benefits for your garden, make for a great food source for reptiles, birds, aquarium fish, fishing bait, the list just keeps going on. And growing earthworms is also a really easy process as well, and there's a ton of different ways that you can actually establish a worm colony, but the most common use is a multi-tier worm farm. We never really planned on actually starting a worm farm. However, one day we did a massive clean of the chicken coop and found a handful, like literally, it was a handful of worms. And from there, my mum actually decided to set up a DIY worm farm. It originally started off with a tier of polystyrene boxes, and the colony just went so well that we then upgraded to a purchased worm farm kit. We now use the Tumbleweed brand's Worm Cafe purchased from Bunnings, and this is a simple 3-tiered worm farm which sells for $86, and this includes the $84 worm farm and the $2 compulsory snag that you have to buy when you go to Bunnings. Now, these tiered setups are most popular because it allows you to rotate around your compost. So when you buy it brand new, you start off with about filling the tiers halfway with some basic organic compost, and from there you add in your worm starters. And the way this functions is the top tier receives all of your green fresh matter, and when this gets filled up, you then rotate it down to the bottom, bring all the other tiers up, and then just continue. Eventually, your tiers will be filled with nutrient-rich compost as the worms break down the organic materials you add, and that way you've got this beautiful soil that you can then go ahead and add to your garden. In our worm farm, we basically throw in all of our green kitchen scraps and organic material from the garden. We basically have a little Chobani yogurt tub on our kitchen bench near the sink, and that just gets the day's green scraps like veggie skins, offcuts, eggshells, coffee grounds, fruit scraps, you name it, whatever's fresh and green, it goes into the worm farm. And from the garden, we don't add too much, but we might add some random things like pruned leaves, old seasoned plants like tomato vines and whatnot. Dried autumn leaves is also something we add a lot. And these are all surprisingly good because the worms just destroy and devour whatever you put into it. It's always good to ensure that you've got both fresh and dry materials, and that's added to ensure that your worm farm doesn't get too soggy and wet. And you might also think that a worm farm might smell with all of this organic material breaking down, but a healthy worm farm should just smell like fresh soil or predominantly the material that you're adding in. As your farm accrues more and more organic material, which is basically worm food, the worms start to reproduce and the colony increases because they've got the food to sustain the numbers. And this farm easily has over 2,000 worms, and that's probably just a very low ball estimate. There might be close to 10,000 in here, and it sort of reaches a balance point with the amount of food that's going into the worm farm. So you don't ever need to really worry about starving the worms out or killing off your colony. As long as you have a stable, constant amount of food going in, the worms are going to be totally fine. And once your worm farm tiers start to get full or reach the sort of brink, that's where you can use the worm-rich compost to add into your garden. The compost or soil they make is going to be full of natural microbes, carbon, trace elements, and minerals, which all come from the organic material that you add and the worms so amazingly break down. It was a great coincidence that we actually had to do this week because the worm farm was basically about to explode with the amount of compost that the worms had made in the farm. But all you need to do is basically take out half of the worm compost that's in there, mix it with some regular garden soil, and you immediately make it into this super substrate for growing plants. And this also returns the worms back into your garden to give you that ongoing benefit that they provide in a concentrated farm as well. And in the meanwhile, the worms are still doing an amazingly useful job, because as they break down the organics, there's a lot of moisture that gets released from the greens that you add. And this trickles through the tiers, collecting all the powerful nutrients and drains down into the very bottom tier, into this concentrated worm juice fertilizer. The worm farm then allows you to drain this out, and you can dilute it with some basic water and then give it to your plants as a super feed when you go ahead and water them. So we actually have a 40-litre storage container in the backyard that contains this diluted worm juice. So my dad can then go ahead and water all of his seedlings. But with all the nutrients from layers and layers of broken down organics, the seedlings just grow amazingly well. And it's evident to see the difference between plants that do and don't get the worm juice, because the worm juice is basically jam-packed full of nutrients. Now, all of what I've said so far sounds very easy, and it absolutely is. A worm farm is the most easiest sort of farm to go ahead and have in your backyard. It requires very, very little maintenance from you, and the maintenance that you do need to do is something that's going to be super beneficial and something that you will really enjoy, because you'll see immediate results from it when you do go ahead and use the products that the worms make for you. But there's a few things that you want to avoid with a worm farm. First of which is adding any dairy or meat products. So you don't want to be adding any sort of excess yogurt or milk products, or you don't want to be adding any meat offcuts or meat scraps, because these could just lead to additional unwanted mold or fungus growth, cause some bad smells, and they're just sort of an unsafe environment when you've got mold growing in your worm farm, especially when you're dealing with it, getting mold spores inhaled or those kinds of things. It's just better to avoid it entirely. Secondly, you do want to make sure that your worm farm isn't too wet or too dry. I sort of recommend to aim for a moist soil situation where it's firm to the grass, and that way if you are going to hold the compost, it doesn't break apart in your hands. But if the worm farm is too dry, you can always add a little bit of water to it. It isn't going to hurt the worms in any way. And if it is too wet, just add a bunch of dry materials, some dry hay or dry autumn leaves. These are going to be totally fine as well. Now let's talk about some of the other cool sort of applications that you can utilize for earthworms. Now, when you are culturing earthworms and you want to feed them to something like birds or fish or reptiles, you may sort of be concerned about, you just taking them from the outdoors in this compost heap and putting them directly into your aquariums or enclosures. Let's talk about the example of aquariums just for convenience sake. But yeah, the one thing I would recommend is just get yourself some aqua soil, or if you know any soil which is sterile, you could just go ahead and bake it. Then you can just put it in a Tupperware container, add some worms in there, and just keep it in a cool, dark place. And that way the worms are going to be fine for anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, and you can always add a little bit of green matter just to give them some food. But what this aqua soil does is the worms will just start eating through it. It'll purge their insides to make sure that they have nothing which could be potentially dangerous to the animals that you will feed. And that way it's sterile, clean earthworms that you can go ahead and feed to your fish. I decided to feed my fish for the first time with these earthworms, and it was a very cool experience to see both my freshwater fish go absolutely ham, destroying all the worms left, right, and center. And surprisingly, my saltwater fish went absolutely nuts as well, which is something that I never expected, but it just shows that it's a really fun and interactive way to feed your fish. It gives them enrichment where they're biting through the food, thrashing it around, and it's just really cool to see them just showing off this wild, instinctive behavior. Plus, it's a really healthy food to go ahead and feed your fish or pets as well. Alrighty, Bodgies and Widgies, I really hope you enjoyed that video. And it was a very interesting concept that I wanted to show off to you. And it goes to show just how easy it is to go ahead and have a great worm farm. And you don't necessarily even have to have it to the scale that we have in our backyard, which honestly isn't all that big either. It's a nice, compact little setup, which just takes a corner in the backyard. But there are tons of different farms out there, a lot of which are smaller. For those of you that are maybe in a townhouse or a smaller living environment, you definitely still can have a great worm farm, and there are a ton of DIY options out there. Polystyrene boxes, Tupperware containers, and they all function the same, and that's why a tiered worm farm setup is always great. But if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more different videos aside from just the fish, make sure you let me know in the comment section down below. And we have passed the 1,000 subscriber mark, so a huge thank you. And if you want to see more videos like this, please do feel free to subscribe to the channel as well. But that's it from me, so as always, stay happy, stay safe, stay Aussie Australian, Bodgie out.